Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Welcome to the Bill Walton Show. I'm Bill Walton. Well, we're back with a topic and a guest. In fact, two guests that have been on the show many times before, but in particular, this one we want to follow up is a book that we talked about, I think it was in May of this year, called The Weaponization of Loneliness, which is subtitled How Tyrants Stoke Our Fear of Isolation to Silence, Divide, and Conquer. And Stella Morabito, welcome back, Stella.
Thank you.
Is the author, and she's also a senior contributor at Federalist, where she's been there since 2014, writing on threats to our freedom from propaganda, groupthink, censorship, and cult mindsets. And as I mentioned, her book is caught fire, and I needed help managing this conversation. I've asked Mark Tapscott to come back on. Mark, as you may recollect, is an amazing writer and thinker and journalist. He has won, he covers Congress for the Epic Times and was founding editor of Hill Faith, which is a Christian ministry serving congressional aides on Capitol Hill. He's in the National Freedom of Information Act Hall of Fame and was CPAC's Conservative Journalist of the Year Award in 2008. And since then, he's been being amazing ever since. So we really... I think, Stella, you struck a nerve with this. I've gotten more comments on the show we did on the weaponization of loneliness, I think, than anything I can recollect.
Well, that's wonderful. But I think it resonates. I think my thesis resonates with a lot of people because people are scared to death of being ostracized just for speaking their minds. And so, if you got a lot of comments, first of all, that's fantastic.
And hopefully we sold a lot of books.
Well, that would be fantastic too.
Wait, we need a book.
Right here.
Right here, let me see.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, it resonates. The message resonates. And first of all, I also want to say it's great to be back here with you, Bill, and wonderful to be here with Mark. I submitted some op-eds for the Examiner back in the day, and it was great to
You were editorial
go back
page
and
editor.
forth. He was the executive editor at the time. Yeah. So anyway,
First, did he accept them? And did he write? Did he rewrite them?
Unless they were too long. Unless they went over that, what is it, 500 words?
Something like that. I have to say, you get people together in a journalistic setting, and there's usually a lot of compliments being thrown around. But this is absolutely sincere. I have read hundreds and hundreds of new submissions. With Stella's first, I said to myself then, and I think I said something to you about this, you're going to go a long way because she has real talent. And this book that she has done, as I said in a review a couple of weeks ago, it ranks up there with some real classics in political theory.
Thank you.
You compared it to
Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, and especially the Jean-Francois, I can't say it, Revel, a French guy, the impulse, the totalitarian impulse, which basically is a wonderful explanation of why liberals inevitably end up approaching tyranny.
Well, I want to talk a couple of big things here. One, if you can recap the thesis of the book, and we can talk about that. But I really want to get to lines of action and what people can do about this.
Mm-hmm.
But then the other thing is in between the time you and I talked last and today, we now have the U.S. Surgeon General who's going to solve our loneliness problem. They just put out a big 81-page report called our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation. So we're now going to have the federal government, which I would think would be one of the main culprits behind isolation and loneliness, but that's one man's view. And then we also have Chris Murphy, he's a Democrat congressman from Connecticut, I think.
Senator from Connecticut.
Senator. Well, he's introduced the National Strategy for Social Connection Act.
Right on the heels of Murphy's advisory, the Surgeon General's advisory. Right.
But let's.
It's coincidental. It's
Oh,
coincidental.
I think they read Stella's book and thought there's a big opportunity. So, Stella, to recap, and then we'll jump.
All righty. Well, the weaponization of loneliness is basically about isolation, social isolation as a political weapon. How tyrants really, especially in modern history, but from time immemorial, have tried to navigate people into their narrative through that threat of being ostracized if you don't accept the narrative. So, I go through, I've got about 10 chapters where I examine the conformity impulse as well as the totalitarian impulse and the making of mobs and what I call the machinery of loneliness, and how tyrants, whether it's instinctive or conscious, seem to understand how to push people to into their propaganda and their agendas through that fear, cultivating that fear of ostracism. And we can go into, how that's been done even most recently with COVID. But on the heels of so much of this, including COVID, you have the Surgeon General of the United States coming out with this advisory, which means that it's a very urgent public health matter to solve the loneliness epidemic and social isolation in this country. And we can go into more detail about how this advisory would basically bureaucratize and regulate human relationships, which is, unbelievable, that we would get to that point in this country. But on the heels of that advisory, just recently, Chris Murphy, the Democrat senator from Connecticut, comes out with this strategy, his act. It's supposed to be an act of Congress. He introduced the bill called the Strategy for Social Connection Act. So here, which would install an office. Right now, it's proposed in the president's office to create these strategies to help us, kind of get over our loneliness epidemic, which I agree with you, Bill, the government is the main culprit for the loneliness epidemic. I mean, if you look at all the policies, they're not dialing back on any of them, whether it has to do with family breakdown, urban blight, addictions, all of that.
Now, this is the same government that said, lock yourself up.
Yes.
Don't talk to anybody. Stay as far away from other people as you can. Cover your face. And I forget all the other fun things they had us do. Oh, shut your business down, unless you're Lowe's or Home Depot or one of the big ones. But if you're a small business, you got to shut your business down. Restaurant, gyms, churches, let's shut those down. Mm-hmm. Churches aren't, we don't need those. I mean, come on. Nobody goes to church. So that's what they did. And now 3 years later, they're coming along to say, well, gee, now we're going to solve all the problems that we created. Mark, you cover the Hill. Tell us about Senator Murphy.
You captured it in that last sentence. We're going to solve this problem that we have created. I've been in Washington, D.C. Since 1976, in government, working on Capitol Hill, and then for 30-some years as a journalist covering Capitol Hill and national politics. And this is a pattern that you see over and over again. The government identifies what it considers to be a problem and then puts itself forward as the solution. And of course, the solution always magnifies the power, the influence, the cost, and the consequences of government. It's like Ronald Reagan said, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help you. Well, thanks, but no thanks, many Americans say, and hopefully more Americans will be saying in the future.
So, Stella, what kind of reaction have you gotten from just sort of the rest of us men on the street, men and women on the street? What are people saying? I know Mercy Schlapp has been singing the praises of the book
Yeah.
every time she gives a speech. Mercy, of course, is with CPAC and is on, I think she's on
She's on Newsmax now.
Newsmax all the time. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm thrilled with
Yeah.
Mercedes, promotion of my book. I well, just in general, people just say, "Wow, yeah, I thought I was all alone," and to understand how this works is very, very helpful, and to understand that this is something that everybody is dealing with. I think we all know that instinctively, where we're afraid to say something because we're afraid we're going to offend or people are going to shun us if, we don't have the right view. And we instinctively know that. And that's why we tend to self-censor. But of course, those decades of self-censorship through political correctness, the bill has come due and lots of really destructive agendas come out of that self-censorship. But most people in general are just very, very happy to have it all kind of put in one place. People have read my book and have been dealing with a lot of the social pressures that I discuss in the book. And, social pressures have been discussed by a long line of like social scientists like Solomon Asch and Stanley Milgram, who did those experiments, very famous experiments in the 50s and 60s about social conformity. It's not like we don't know about it, but I wrote the book because I thought it was important to have all of that in one place to kind of go through the history, of how these tactics, or what I call the machinery of loneliness, has been used to control whole populations, the war on the private sphere, how political correctness, identity politics, and mobs
Walk through the tactics.
press.
Let's dig into how this really operates.
Okay, well, I reduce it to what I call the machinery of loneliness.
Okay.
Identity politics, which serves to divide us, to categorize us as, not individual human beings who are unique or made in the image of God, but just, pigeonhole us into oppressor or victim status. That's identity politics. Political correctness is meant to induce self-censorship, to make us either shut up or even lie about what we believe in order to gain social approval. And then, of course, you've got the mob. And mobs come in many different forms, whether it's a street mob like Antifa or, a human relations department, a corporation, or social media mobs. All of that meant to enforce identity politics and political correctness, which is meant to divide and separate us and make us drive us into the kind of isolation that Hannah Arendt talked about, how tyrannical governments always seek to bring about isolation, to isolate people against one another, because that's really the only way you can control them.
That's I couldn't improve upon that. That is exactly the process. And I would just point out that you go back to Genesis 1. God said the reason he made woman is because it's not good for man to be alone. We are social animals. We need each other. And we need each other, especially in the context of understanding who we are, why we're here, and what our purpose is for being here, which makes it ultimately a spiritual issue. And that's why tyrants invariably, always seek to destroy the private sector, because the relationship between me and my God, or you and your God, is a private relationship. Fundamentally, it is a private relationship, and you're accountable to him. They can't stand that, because that puts God between them and what they want, which is control.
And it also gives us inner strength.
Yes.
The strength that we need to resist these tyrannies.
Amen.
And of course, that's why the private sphere has always come under attack. I would add to that, Genesis, I was thinking about how the very first thing that the tyrant, the serpent, Satan, whatever you want to call it, the evil force does when pushing man to his fall is to get Eve isolated. She's by
Yes.
herself. She can't consult with her husband. She's being influenced in isolation. And that's often the key. That's how this phenomenon works. It's why all cult leaders like Jim Jones or, drive people into isolation first in order to
Yeah.
control them. Patty Hearst, when she was kidnapped, she was locked in a closet for 6 weeks, during which time she got these Maoist, these propaganda sessions drilled into her. And then she came out 6 weeks later with her new identity that she later told Larry King in an interview that she totally lost her sense of self after that whole episode. But anyway, I'm digressing here, but my whole point, of course, has to do with isolation from the very beginning, from the garden.
Yeah. It's not unique to the Christian understanding of the world, because Aristotle, in his The Politics, the first line is, man is a social animal. But I think the fundamental distinction that is at stake here, Jesus pointed to it when he said to the Pharisees about render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and that which is God to God. And that said, the state is not the whole. There are certain things that the state is God created to take care of, but there are all these other things, these private, separate things from the state, that are between us and our God. And that's why the Declaration of Independence says in the opening, we have these certain inalienable rights that we were endowed with by our Creator. That is the tyrant's worst enemy.
Mm-hmm.
This is the Bill Walton Show, and I'm here with Stella Morabito, who's written the topic of discussion today, a book, Weaponization of Loneliness, and with Mark Tapscott, who's with the Epic Times and covers the Congress. I feel sorry for you, Mark.
So do I.
Somebody's got to do it. And we're trying to get to the bottom of this loneliness machine that Stella's identified, and I'm still asking myself a lot of questions as we talk, which is, is it different now from what it was 50 years ago? Is it that much more apparent now? I mean, my view is it is, but I would go back to saying, okay, what are the things that make us less lonely? Well, civic society institutions like the Boy Scouts and church and the Lions Club and things like that, they keep us feeling like we're not alone. There's also this notion of our relationship with God and churches, and we've seen church attendance plummet. And then we've got the government's role. I mentioned, just 2 years ago, we were all locked down, not allowed to interact with each other. And so it does seem like it's getting worse, but fill in the details. What else is there that makes it different now from 1973?
Yeah, there's been a real dive in social trust. I mean, if you look at the General Social Survey that was done in the 70s, and I can't cite the statistics, but to the question, that you can generally trust people, there's been a huge drop in people who say that you can today versus when that survey was first administered with that question. So social trust is really important for a civil society to exist. I mean, you want to be able to, walk down the street without fear of being attacked. You want to be able to, smile at a stranger without them thinking you've got, some ulterior motive. Social trust is it's like the oil that keeps a good society going. And yes, I think it's a whole lot more evident to us today than it was 50 years ago. However, I would say that that's for us, people who are, what I call pro-thought, people who think about these things versus those who have been thoroughly propagandized or, indoctrinated with these narratives, don't really get it because they, are isolated to a great extent, whether it's through the propagandizing in the public schools or universities, and people feel drawn to that only because they're fearful of being rejected if they don't accept that line. There's a recent poll that just came out that people are not proud to be American anymore. Well, that's just the result of decades of propaganda in the academia.
And polls just sometimes show
Oh.
how susceptible people are to the
That's-
latest. But
What they tell you or what people say they believe.
well, if I had
They don't
to, if
tell
I
you.
had to put one, let me throw a candidate out here for the biggest villain, which would be identity politics, and in particular, critical race theory,
Mm-hmm.
where it basically says no matter, you can't do anything for the fact that if you're white,
Mm-hmm.
you are racist.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no way to atone for that sin. I mean, Ibrahim X. Kendi is, unlike God, he won't forgive us for that sin of being white. And then we've then sliced and diced not just black people, but we've got every single small category of subgroups, and we have what they call intersectionality.
Right.
So if you're black, if you're female are also or if you're gay. And we've got a press secretary now for the president who fits the intersectionality thing perfectly. She's black, she's gay, and she's female.
Mm-hmm.
So
And
she's the
that's-
perfect
points.
victim.
The perfect victim.
Victim
But
points.
it's got us all
No.
now. You're walking down the street, and you just wonder what's in people's minds, where they're all deciding they're sizing people up, and they know you can't be like each other because you're in a different category.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that a you're the expert?
Well, it's insidious. I mean, you're basically, boxing yourself into these identities, and it's interesting because as it gets narrower and narrower, you'd think that you come right down to the individual, but what you come right down to is the atomized individual,
Yes.
the individual who has become even more isolated through all of these box scores or, whatever you want to call it, claiming these victim points or
No, there's a victim scorecard.
Oh, there is
Yeah.
a scorecard,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
also for oppressors.
Oppressors.
Yeah, I mean, if you're white and male and straight and so on and so forth, English speaking, or they have all these different identifiers.
Does this come from the government, or did it infect the government? Because these ideas came out of academia, and I now think of the federal government as the biggest, along with universities and K-12 and now the
Mhm.
military. They're really pushing these ideas of identity, but it didn't
Right.
originate in the government.
No, I don't.
So this is unusual
Well,
totalitarianism.
these
'cause-
academics with these theories, whether it's critical race theory or gender theory or queer theory or whatever they want to call it, it came out of academia. We can go back and talk about the Frankfurt School 100 years ago and the long march through all the institutions.
Yes.
But one of the main institutions to capture
We've covered
is the
that a lot
government.
here. I love, but anyway, continue.
But the government was basically captured by these theories. I'm not the expert on that, but that is the trend line for all of this. If you look at the Frankfurt School and you look at all of these theories coming out of academia, that's what you have. I mean, you have them infecting, first of all, academia, because that's how you get credentialed to go into all the other institutions, whether it's law or medicine or anything else. You've got to, then you are in a position to, run for office, take over the school boards, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, that's the farm team for running for higher office. So it began, I don't know, go back to that Weaver title, ideas have consequences.
Yeah.
But anyway.
You're taking me back to my youth in a couple of ways.
Good.
Because your question about is it different from 50 years ago? My wife and I were talking about this recently, and we both were talking about how much we enjoyed when we were children in the 50s, 7, 8, 9 years old. Every kid in the neighborhood had a bicycle. We stayed out until our mothers and dads forced us to come back home, and nobody worried about it because neighborhoods were basically safe.
Yeah, and people
That's
knew
not
one
the case
another.
now. That's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
The Long March, when I first became interested in political things in 1964, as a result of Ronald Reagan's The Speech, the first serious book that I read was called The Democrat's Dilemma by a man named Phil Crane, who later became a congressman.
Remember him?
His book documented the growth of the League for Industrial Democracy in Britain and then in the United States. The League for Industrial Democracy was the Fabian Socialist. And their march through the American institutions began with the academic world and then expanded from there. It's not simply a matter of government, but government is, after academia, the first object of the Long March because it's the key to influencing every other institution.
Can I do my version of that history?
Sure.
See what you,
It's your
you
show,
guys
Bill.
can well, but you're here as the subject matter expert. Long March, Gramsci, Italian theorist
Absolutely.
in the 20s.
Yes.
Marxism was basically an economic theory, oppressed versus oppressed, the capitalists versus the workers, and that's the way they proceeded forever. And then Gramsci began to realize, well, wait a second, the workers are not really rising up here. It's not, we don't have an economic problem. That we're not solving their economic. They don't want to be Marxist. They want more refrigerators or consumer goods.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't working. And so he observed that if it's not working in economics, it could work in social settings. And he then decided you've got to take over the universities, the government, the K-12, the cultural institutions. And that's the Long March, where they're taking these ideas and they're infiltrating these institutions. And that's why when we see it happening in the military, it's like the culmination of the Long March, because that for a long time was the most
traditional
color, race, sex orientation blind institution in the world.
Yeah, the United States military became a model of integration for the world to follow. And look what they're doing to it now. The isolation, the loneliness is the inevitable product of alienation. Marxism's fundamental point is alienation between those who are the rulers and those who are the oppressed. Just change the categories and you've got critical race theory. It's not coincidental that critical race theorists, their roots go back to Marx. And that's their business, as Stella brilliantly describes it. It's the weaponization of loneliness, because when we're separated, when we don't work together, we are controllable. And that's what it's about.
But how are we supposed to deal with this? Because the question I asked Stella last time is, you identify the totalitarianism of the past. You had, you identify Cromwell in England, who used his religion as a kind of totalitarian force. And we had the French, Robespierre. Then we fast forward to Lenin and Stalin, and then we had, I don't know what category Hitler was in exactly, but certainly you've got Mao and things like that. You had an individual who had his cult following that imposed this on a society. Now it seems like we're talking about everybody in academia or everybody in the military. And it's these ideas that doesn't seem to have, you called it hydra-headed?
Hydra-headed beast,
Hydra-headed.
Corporate world.
What's the nature of this beast? What do we do about it?
Yeah, it all kind of comes out of this idea, this globalist push. Well, I think they've made it very clear that for them, the enemy is speech, is us talking to one another, is conversation. That's why you see such a hard push for these disinformation governance boards, or you're gonna keep seeing this over and over again. misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and they're trying to control speech, and censorship is critical to pushing, whether it's a hydra-headed beast or it's just a demagogue operating on, with his cult following. It's freedom of speech, having actual conversations that they cannot control or that they want to control, but having those conversations and resisting the urge to self-censor is really the only way out.
Well, let me amplify that. You mentioned misinformation. What are your three? I know that I've forgotten the site. Misinformation, and what's the other?
Disinformation and malinformation. They claim that misinformation.
Well, let me do the they.
Okay.
Because this is coming straight from our government. This is straight out of CISA, and Ben Weingarten. Ben.
Oh yeah.
He did the investigative work on this, and this was a report that just came out. And in the Missouri case, I think it was Missouri versus Biden, I think. Anyway, they won the case, and they're forcing the government to stop doing what it was doing. And what was happening was CISA, which is run by Jen Easterly, they'd redefine Homeland Security, which is supposed to protect our infrastructure. They redefined infrastructure to include elections. And they had to protect our elections, our election infrastructure, which meant you're not allowed to talk about 2020. There's accepted speech and non-accepted speech. And then she brought in this notion that the American mind is our cognitive infrastructure. And they had a duty to make sure that only certain kinds of thought was allowed, misinformation, disinformation, but the favorite's malinformation. And malinformation she defined as, well, these are true facts, but we don't agree with the way they're being interpreted.
Or the context, right?
I mean,
it's Orwellian. It's dystopian.
And she was convening social media companies. I mean, all these paranoid fantasies that people thought you're just being a conspiracy person. No, it's really happening.
Yeah, it really is happening.
And this actually, I don't know how far back you want to go, but if you look at the Frankfurt School professor, academic, Herbert Marcuse, he came up with this theory called repressive tolerance, which really meant you really shouldn't tolerate this idea of free speech, because what that means is that that the oppressed don't really have a voice. Or I don't know. I mean, he had these, he had written up this whole theory of repressive tolerance, which was essentially an attack on freedom of speech, because he knew darn well that if people were talking to one another, exchanging information, verifying reality with one another, that there was no way they could pull off this what I would call this revolution that I would call a self-supremacist revolution. These guys are not really in it for they may believe their own propaganda about justice, equality, and so on, but they're really in it for themselves, in my view. They're just self-supremacists, is the way I put it. But that he knew that free speech was the thorn in the side of their designs, their social engineering designs. So this theory of repressive tolerance took off. And today you see it in campus, like free speech is hate speech. You'll see these kinds of slogans that come straight out of that whole theory that Marcuse had to try to shut down free speech.
One of the many ways that you see the influence of Marcuse on that particular point is in CRT. The white supremacist cannot but oppress, and therefore must be repressed.
That's right. It's a a no-win catch-22 situation that they set you in. Color blindness. It's so weird. I mean, in my chapter, I have a chapter on identity politics, and I start off with a Martin Luther King quote about how people should be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. And then after that, you've got what's his name, Ibram Kendi, saying that colorblindness is just an excuse for racism. I don't know the exact quote, but that's basically what he says, is in complete contradiction to King's dream.
By the way, I think his real name's something like Brian Smith.
Yeah.
Don't forget the X, Ibram X. Kendi.
Yeah.
Yeah. X. Oh, I don't know. Elon Musk likes the word letter X now. But anyway, I don't know what's going on with that. But yeah, Ibram X. Kendi.
Why did Musk pick the X?
Like Malcolm X? I don't know. But anyway, and going back to what you were saying before, Mark, about this, how the revolutions pushed this awareness of, the oppressed or whatever. If you go back to Marx, he talked about class consciousness. Okay, so what that means is, don't look at somebody as an individual, as a unique human being. Look at them in terms only of the haves versus the have-nots. What do they have that you don't? And it's the same thing with all the rest of this stuff. Critical race theory, you're only supposed to judge people by their race. And by the way, you can have black skin, but be considered a white supremacist in critical race theory if you accept, any of these so-called white values.
Yeah.
And I have in my chapter, in there where I talk about that exhibit that was up for just a couple days at the Smithsonian, the African American Museum.
Whiteness.
White culture.
Yeah. White culture.
Yeah, or signs of white. These are all universal values that were listed in that infographic. Being on time, punctuality, being nice to people, being polite was considered a, quote, white value. Working hard. All of these things that are universal values, really, universal virtues that have nothing to do with your race or ethnicity or religion, pretty much not your religion, but they, it's fascinating to me because the target, in my view, was not, quote, whiteness per se. The target was all of those universal values.
Yes.
That is what that infographic and all these theorists are seeking to destroy. Yeah. The things that hold up civil society, that allow us to be friends, that allow us to talk to one another.
Yes.
So, Kenny, we've got a graphic we could use. It's the Smithsonian exhibit. I think the exhibit was called White Culture in the United States, and it was in the Black History Museum for 2 days. For 2 days, but it was like I've got the PDF of it, but it was the white culture's rugged individualism, whatever.
Scientific method.
Family structure. It has the nuclear family, father, mother, 2 to 3 children is ideal. Emphasis on scientific method. The Protestant work ethic. Future orientation. Plan for the future. Delay gratification.
Having goals.
Time. Following rigid time schedules. It goes on and on. I would look at it a little differently. I'd look at this as colorblind and saying, gee, if you wanted to be successful, what's the success formula? Get married, go to work, stay married, save some money,
keep working,
invest in yourself.
Yep.
These are sort of the things that make people successful. So I was pleased or mortified to know that's white culture.
Kamala Harris, our esteemed vice president, yesterday was blasting Governor DeSantis in the Florida curriculum on black studies, and she seized upon one point out of the 191 basic points in the curriculum. That basic point that she seized on was that there were, in spite of everything, there were individual slaves in the South prior to the Civil War who used the skills that they obtained in slavery to advance themselves. There were actually some black millionaires in the South prior to the Civil War because of that. And that's a testimony to the human spirit's determination, no matter what. Mm-hmm. If you choose to seek to better yourself in any situation. She ignored the other 190 and blasted DeSantis for that one thing, precisely because.
I agree, Roxy. He's saying some really alarming things.
I mentioned Kamala and Roxy is upset. She condemned it because it represented a real historical application of those white values that should be an example to the current generations, an inspiration to them.
So this is a funny kind of totalitarianism.
Yeah.
And frankly,
In her case.
I don't get it because it seems very nihilistic. It seems like it's built on destruction
Yeah.
and not on creating anything. I mean,
That's right.
And that's a source of hope for us.
I do. I mean, I think
Yeah.
this is unsustainable. I don't think something like this can
Absolutely.
go on forever.
Yeah.
No. However, I think the goal, of course, is to destroy all of these things. Destroy all that's good that
It's
allows you to.
nihilistic. Go ahead.
No,
Yeah.
in order to get that iron grip on power, the question is whether or not we're all destroyed in the process. But you're right; it's not sustainable at all. It can't be. The revolutions always eat their own anyway.
Yeah. I'm optimistic for a couple of, I think, very significant reasons. Number one, the Supreme Court's recent decision on freedom of speech. There seems to be a continuing general consensus in our country among most people. Yeah, it's a free country. You should be able to say and think what you want. And especially when what's involved is your religious freedom, your religious expression and practice. People get upset when the government tells them, no, you can't believe that. You can't believe that. And there is a reaction to it. You see the same reaction in this explosive growth of the parents movement against the wokeism and CRT in local schools. People, they're not
That's
going
really,
to sit
and
back.
that is exploding.
It is. It really is. It's pretty amazing to watch. And one of the biggest stories that has not been published or covered as it deserves, in my judgment, as a journalist, is the sudden, in the last 2 years, 6 states have adopted genuine school choice. The money follows the child. The child doesn't go where the state says go. The parents make that decision. That will spread to more and more states, and that will preserve the avenue of maintaining those who understand and appreciate and insist upon the recognition of traditional values, including freedom of speech. Oklahoma, which is my home state by coincidence, was the most recent one. I think Kentucky. I don't know the others, but this has just happened, and it's happened under the radar. The teachers' unions, of course, have been watching it, and they're very concerned about it. But the mainstream media hasn't picked up on it yet. And of course, when they do, they'll be very critical of it.
Yeah, I think that is a very hopeful sign because what that attests to is what I mentioned in my last chapter, the spread of what I call parallel institutions, or
Yes.
what are called parallel institutions. These institutions that pretty much have to take over when the ones run by the government are corrupt, or the ones like the education sector. Now we've got the medicine has been corrupted, and you're going to need more and more, kind of a spread. It should be a mushrooming
Yes.
to make it effective and make it hard to repress of these parallel institutions. The thing that I think people need to be aware of is that these tyrants are always on a search and destroy mission
Yes.
for any sign of independence that way,
Sure.
whether it's institutional, whether it's just I think at this point even just a conversation. I mean, one of the purposes of identity politics is to make sure that people, uh, especially youth, are very careful about who they talk to out of fear of being shunned. If
Yes.
they don't want that brush of guilt by association. If they are connected with someone who the left has identified as fascist, white supremacist, all the smear words that are used to demonize, bigot, racist, transphobe. It goes on and on. It's a really long list. Election denier, anti-vaxxer, all of these things. It's hard to keep track of. But a lot of folks, especially, I see a lot of young suburban women very influenced by that. You saw a lot of them out in the Black Lives Matter a couple of years ago. Those riots and everything. College educated, they are very, very careful about their status, and they want to be very certain that they're not like associating with someone who would be classified, as identity politics does, as the oppressor. So you see all of these dynamics in so many different ways. And the purpose of my book is to try to expose a lot of that so that people are more able to speak freely to one another, or to understand the strategies that are used against them, as well as develop counter strategies for that suppression of speech to push up
Well,
against that.
it seems to me one of the strategies would be getting together with people face to face in social settings
Yes.
and sharing what you believe is true, and that and feeling free to speak. I mean, we I don't know if I should say this on camera, but when we had the lockdowns, and I'm going to chat with the camera here, I'm sure somebody's listening. We formed a quarantine club, and we decided that maybe we ought to stick together and visit with people face to face, so we didn't feel so lonely and we didn't feel so isolated.
Yeah.
And if we had questions about what was happening, we could talk with other people about the questions to figure out what was true. That seems to me to be a very healthy human thing to do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think
Absolutely.
one of the strategies has got to be, and maybe the school choice is part of that, but one of the strategies got to be, we have to have alternate mini institutions where people can get together and do just that.
And that's what church does.
Yeah, well, that was a softball.
Thank you. One of the real heroes, unrecognized to this point, but I think he will be at some point, of the pandemic resistance, if you will, is Pastor John MacArthur out in California. He resolved at the outset, when Gavin Newsom said the churches can't meet, they continued meeting. And they've had lots of litigation, and so far they are winning.
Good.
The reason they're winning is because the Supreme Court, Justice Alito, in the decision involving the New York Catholic Church that was challenging the shutdown, Alito said, in his opinion, we meant what we said about the First Amendment. And even the Ninth Circuit is getting that message, the Ninth Circuit being the California one that's so liberal. Churches are where people, they're based on a relationship, the relationship between the individual and Jesus Christ as their Savior, and the fellowship that they have with other believers. And that grows out of the family. That is resistance central to the state, and it always will be.
Well, you're in the belly of the beast with your ministry on Capitol Hill.
Capitol Hill, you would think there are about 20,000 congressional aides, mostly young men and women, the average age about 27, tend to be from the best schools, very highly educated, tend to be very liberal as a result, and radical. But there is about a third of them who come from the South or the West, who maintain traditional orientations. It's a hostile missionary field, if you will.
Yeah, I would think.
And it didn't really dawn on me. The Lord called me to begin this ministry, Hill Faith, 3 years ago. It really didn't dawn on me until about a year into it. My gosh, this is not the jungle, but it's a hostile missionary field. And one of the reasons is because so many of these very intelligent, very dedicated young men and women come with these predispositions against spirituality, simply against spirituality, because they've been, they come from a materialist understanding of the world, which is exactly what tyrants want them to think, But when I challenge them with questions such as, for example, how do you explain the empty tomb of Christ? Did his friends get his body? Did they steal his body? Did the enemies of Christ steal his body? They don't know the answer to that. And then I explained to them, well, it wasn't their friends, wasn't his friends, because they were all a bunch of cowards. They scattered when Christ was arrested. And beyond that, the Roman guard that was guarding the tomb, there's no way the disciples would have been able to overcome those guys, steal the body, hide it, and go away. His enemies, the disciples were proclaiming the resurrection a couple of weeks later. If his enemies had stole the body, they would have rolled it down Main Street, Jerusalem, and that would have been the end of Christianity. And when these young people realize, I don't have an answer to that, it opens the door once again to the possibility, well, maybe there is more to this spiritual stuff than I've been told. And it takes time, but they do respond.
That's a really interesting illustration. I think it speaks to a couple of things. One of which is the extreme ignorance
Yes.
of the scriptures. They generally don't
And
study
history.
that stuff at all,
Yeah.
and so the questions never even occur to them. And yet also they've got this worldview that's been imprinted on them, whether it's through the schools or propaganda or whatever, that's very anti-religious or anti-faith. And a lot of that, I think, is dictated by, again, that fear of being tainted.
Yes, absolutely.
With guilt by association, to associate with someone who's considered, faithful, spiritual, unless it's, spiritual, not religious. They've got these new, new age things that they, to try to fill that vacuum. But it's really interesting. It's a great illustration.
One of the things that you notice when you're talking with people on the Hill about spiritual matters, the idea that no, I don't want to be involved with that. I don't want to be associated with it. Those people are religious nuts.
Mm-hmm.
But then when they realize I need to think about this, I need to really take this seriously and determine what do I really think about this. Sometimes there's this turn. Oh yeah, well, I'm going to be a real rebel. I'm going to think for myself.
Right.
This
That's
is
where it begins.
this is for Stella's pro-thought.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I
But-
was saying that before, that there are really only two political camps left, and I call them pro-thought and anti-thought.
Yeah.
Ignorance is very isolating in itself. I mean,
but if you had a bunch of progressives sitting around this table, they would say the same thing. They would say, we're pro-thought, and those other people
Sure they would.
are deplorable, and troglodytes.
Sure they would. But then why are they censoring anything?
Exactly.
That's
That,
the answer. That's the
they
answer.
can't-
Why can't you hear what
Why
somebody
can't
else
they
is saying?
engage,
Okay.
or why
yeah.
do they cover their? I can't hear you. Basically,
Right.
this sort of arrested development. Where they don't want to even hear. And I think part of that, and I get that, I see that with a lot of youth, where they don't even want to engage. They
Right.
don't even want to hear another point
They don't
of
know
view.
how to engage.
And I think there is a fear
Yeah.
that the natural curiosity might kick in, and they will want to engage, and they don't want that because that will get them tainted.
Yeah.
In the eyes of their reference group or their peer group or whatever.
I'd like to talk for another couple of days, but unfortunately, we probably need to circle in for a bit of a landing, and we'll reconvene. But I've got this notepad here, and I got 4 quadrants in it. And I used to design all these shows. We'll do this, this, this. Well, that went away a long time ago because you can't do that. But I do get down to this lower right quadrant here. It's sort of what I think our solution might be, and I think the solution's spiritual. I've got a good friend, Tony Perkins, who runs Family Research Council, who we work together at Council for National Policy, and he wrote a book called Fear No Man. Yeah. And what you're talking about, Stella, it's real, is that people live in fear of the approval or disapproval of other people. Mm-hmm. And until you can get away from that, mm-hmm. if you can't get away from that, you're going to be forever imprisoned. Yeah.
And that's exactly right.
And you need to think spiritually. You need to believe in order to, whatever, whether it's Christian or
right.
Whatever, that you've got to have that spiritual strength.
That's right. And the less you're able to do that, the more susceptible you are to all of these punishments that will be visited upon you if you don't get with the program. I mean, I think one of the reasons medicine is so corrupt is that these physicians, they go to school for, they go pre-med, then they go to school for 4 more years, and they have the residency, and they get in big debt. But, they've got these goals, material goals, that are all tied up in status and money. And, I know that there are good physicians out there, but by and large, before you know it, the American Medical Association is saying, oh, yeah, we have to do gender-affirming care for kids, or the Academy of Pediatrics or whatever. I mean, how does that happen? Well, it happens through that kind of corruptible process where if you're so invested in the material and your status, and of course that means, what other people are thinking of you, then yes, the fear of having your livelihood taken from you, like, as what happened during COVID, if you didn't get the injection, you'd be, fired from your job, or, it went on and on, or shunned, or have, your relatives. There was a point there at which people were being encouraged to snitch on their friends, their loved ones, their relatives.
Officially encouraged.
All plays into this war on the private sphere of life. But you're exactly right. If you don't have that spiritual grounding where you understand that all the rest of this is really dross in the end, then you're
if you have
captured.
If you have that, you've got the strength to deal with all of it.
You have the strength to resist it, and that's exactly what the tyrant doesn't.
May I quickly point out two?
So we
points.
need your ministry to be very successful, Mark.
Praise the Lord, Lord.
Anyway, sorry, continue.
There are 2 things happening right now that I just find tremendously encouraging. If you've not seen the movie The Sound of Freedom, you've got to go see
about
that.
human trafficking.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The response to that movie has been phenomenal and underreported. And that is significant. The other is the Epoch Times. And I'm going to sound self-serving with this because I work there. The Epoch Times in the last several years has exploded in terms of its readership. And I am convinced that the reason for that, fundamentally the reason for that, is the Epoch Times does not adhere to the mainstream media conformity. We report things the way we see them. And people are yearning for independent authority that they can trust.
Exactly, yeah.
And that is the formula for success.
Last words. Mark, thank you. Stella, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll have to reconvene. Maybe it's not quite the last words. We're going to agree that Chris Murphy's bill on National Strategy for Social Connection don't vote for it.
Yeah.
No.
And
Hard
also,
no.
we're not exactly certain that the U.S. Surgeon General ought to be in the business of solving the things we're talking about, unless he's willing to start a ministry, which actually I don't think I'd like his ministry. So anyway, thanks, guys. And
Thank you.
And Stella, thanks for this beautiful book and giving us
Thank
a chance to have
you.
this conversation. And I might add, Stella's joined the Quarantine Club, and Mark, you're soon to join as well. So thanks for joining the Bill Walton Show. I hope you enjoyed this conversation and others like it. I think you see we're trying to get into what's true and what's right and what's next. And in particular, we're trying to get at truth and freedom. And we're zeroing in on that. And anyway, I hope you'll join us for future episodes. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms. We're on Substack. We're on CPAC now and Monday night. And you can also find us, obviously, on the BillWaltonShow.com website. Please give us your comments. And also, if you get a chance on your platforms to give us a rating, we'd very much like a 5-star rating. And it helps us. It helps advance the show. So, Stella, Mark, thanks. And I'll see you guys both again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Want more? Click the subscribe button or head over to thebillwaltonshow.com to choose from over 100 episodes. You can also learn more about our guest on our Interesting People page. And send us your comments. We read every one, and your thoughts help us guide the show. If it's easier for you to listen, check out our podcast page and subscribe there. In return, we'll keep you informed about what's true, what's right, and what's next. Thanks for joining.